There's a certain disadvantage to being last. So in the interest of minimizing repetition and still being able to give some sort of a summary picture, I pretty much had to redo my whole presentation while Taub was talking. So we'll see how it goes. What I would like to do in my talk is to combine three things. One is a fairly rosy contemporary picture relative to other countries, and this is something that Iran talked about earlier today, how we compare to other Western countries today and some of the main macro numbers. So again, this looks good. I'm going to show you how good. On the other hand, we had social protests that were also discussed in several points in the discussion today. So how does that figure in? If it's so good, what's so bad? And then, since we are good and we had social protests, how does that relate into really what I called here the big picture, which is, and here too, Michal showed you a picture of an iceberg. This is the analogy I've been using for the past couple of years. And in fact, the Sandbacks told me today this is the anniversary of the Titanic, so this is a great day to use this analogy. But I'm going to use a little bit different than Michal, in the following sense, that the issues that the protests were about were primarily the symptoms, and the real problems are the iceberg that are causing the symptoms that are going to be causing a whole host of other issues as well. And so the three things that I'm going to try to merge here together are contemporary versus the social protests, and then what does the actual iceberg look like, and that's going to be my primary emphasis. So first of all, do things really look good compared to other countries? Well, one of the areas that you know is an issue today in Europe, in some of the countries, there's sovereign debt, the ability to repay debt. By the way, most of the stuff that I'm going to show you here either appeared in past State of the Nation reports or will appear in the coming one. That's kind of showing you everything together. So when we talk about sovereign debt, one of the measures is to look at the debt to GDP ratio. The numerator is the entire debt of the country. The denominator is the GDP, what the country produces. And as you can see, a quarter century ago, in the height of our hyperinflation, we were with a debt GDP ratio that's just out of this world, 250%, over 250% of GDP. The OECD countries, this is the average of the Western countries, roughly 50% of GDP. And then a funny thing happened. Over the next 25 years, we traded places. We steadily brought down our debt to GDP ratio, while in the OECD it went up. You can see it really went up in recent years. And in fact, if you look at the 7 leading economies, the G7 countries, United States, Canada, Japan, Italy, France, Germany, and the UK, you can see that the situation is actually even worse there. We've traded places. Where they are today, we were, and where we are, they were. It didn't happen by coincidence. And I'm going to have a lot of criticism on many of our government policies to put it in perspective. Because there were some things that happened here that were very consistent over time and really pretty remarkable when you think about it. Because to lower debt means that you have to be very, very consistent with and very responsible when it comes to government expenditures. And in fact, if you look at total government expenditures in Israel versus GDP per capita, this came out in a recent report. Well, GDP per person since 1970, you can see it increased steadily over time. But now look at government expenditures per person. Usually in most countries we show expenditures relative to GDP, but this is per person. And what you see is that until the mid-80s, this rose. In fact, it actually rose faster than GDP per capita. So expenditures relative to the size of the country grew. But then look what happened since the mid-80s. We have undergone wars, inflation, aliyah, but you wouldn't see it in the data. It's very, very steady. Total government expenditures per person have been very, very steady. And in fact, if you net out the defense, because we have a tendency to blame defense, everything on defense. Well, if you net out defense and you look at just civilian public expenditures, in fact, you take out interest payments as well. So what happened to civilian public expenditures in Israel relative to GDP since 1990? I'm going to break it up into two periods, 1990 to 2005. You can see that in most Western countries, there's a huge variance. Some really increased their expenditures, some really reduced it. And where's the island of stability? It's us, okay? We're the only ones that really didn't change. We remained in the same place. And if you look at the past 5 years, 2005 to 2010, when the West went into a major recession, here you can see that expenditures rose across the board almost. In some cases, really rose relative to GDP. And only 2 countries actually saw a fall, in our case, a big fall. So where we are today, in fact, is that if between the mid-'80s to the mid-2000s, our expenditure to GDP ratio, our civilian expenditures to GDP were roughly the Western average. Today, because the West increased and we reduced in recent years, we're actually spending quite a bit less relative to other countries. Now, one could say that this is actually very responsible government behavior. We're not excessive in our expenditures. Having been there, done that, and you saw the kind of GDP or the kind of debt ratio that we had, we have a lot of experience in being irresponsible in that regard. So we've actually been very responsible on the overall. So much so that then it begs the question, but are we using the money wisely? Because if you're not spending it, you have to allocate it with a lot of wisdom. And here is a big problem in the way we spend our money. Our national priorities are something that are a big problem, and that is really what's underlying many of the problems that I'm going to talk about today. Back to the big picture. Standards of living, the way we measure standards of living are by looking at GDP per capita. You take the pie, divide by the number of people. How fast does that grow? Well, if you look at the past several years, we have actually been growing faster than the leading Western countries in the world, the G7. This is up until the onset of the recession. Once the recession kicked in towards the end of 2008, you can see that income levels or living standards fell in the West a little bit. In ours, they still rose, but they rose by less. The brunt of the recession was in 2009. Incomes fell in the West and in Israel, much more so in the G7 countries. And then as we began to come out of the recession, you can see that basically in all of these years, we've been growing faster. So what's the problem if we're doing so good? Well, the thing is that our big recession is not your big recession. Our big recession was at the beginning of the last decade when we had the Intifada. Then we really hit bottom. And ever since, we've been coming out of it. So the data looks good because we're coming out of a big hole. So GDP per capita is growing faster than in the West. If you look at unemployment, well, unemployment in Israel has been used to be very, very high. And over time, you can see that we're actually becoming normal as far as unemployment rates are concerned. By 2008, we had unemployment rates equal to the G7 countries. When the recession hit, unemployment rose, less so in Israel. And then in 2010, we're on our way down. And today, in fact, we have unemployment rates that most of the West envies, around 5.5%. I mean, they look fantastic even compared to us. But as Eyal and Iran pointed out earlier today, that's a bit misleading. Because unemployment basically shows you the share of people who can't find jobs out of those who are looking for jobs. Our problem is that there are a whole bunch of people who are not participating in the labor force. And so when you talk about employment rates out of the general working age population, here we have a problem, and I'm going to focus on that in a bit. Now, when I said that We have a long-term problem. Just to give you an idea, and you won't see it here, what you'll see is how steady things are and where we are today relative to in the past. If you take the trend line, this is the growth path of Israel, the trend, not the actual path. The trend from 1973, from the Yom Kippur War until the year 2000, it's a very steady line. If you extrapolate on for the past decade, this is what it would look like. Now, keep in mind, again, everything that we underwent, and still, look how steady this growth path is. You barely see some of the big events. They are reflected in fluctuations around the path, but not in changes of the path itself. And you can see the big recession that we had here in the beginning of the decade. We have a big dip in income per capita, and ever since we've been growing out of it. We've just been returning to normal. So that's the fast growth that you saw earlier. Now, just to give you a sense of comparison, we call this in economics stylized facts of the growth process, a very steady growth path. Countries in general tend to have very, very steady growth paths. It is very difficult to move a country from its long-run path. So for comparison, let me show you the American path, and you have a little bit more data than we do, so we can start at 1870. This is the trend line for the United States. Now look how the American growth path compares to a straight line. It is very difficult to move a country from its long-run path. You can see the big recession in recent years, so there's a dip here, and you can see the big depression during the 30s. But in general, the path is very, very steady. What's the problem, which you don't see here, and you don't see in the earlier graph, is that we're falling farther and farther behind over the long run, behind the U.S. and other leading countries. So while our incomes are rising, they're rising at a slower pace. That's part of the iceberg. We'll put that aside and now go to what happened in the summer in Israel. So this is part one, where we are compared to Western countries in general. In recent years, pretty good. Now the summer protests. Many of the speakers before me spoke about the different issues that brought people out in the streets. Let me focus, give you a little bit of data on some of them. One of the issues was on prices. And if you look at prices in Israel, relative to the West, relative to the OECD average, a host of prices in Israel are considered high, but one of the straws that broke the camel's back was the price of cottage cheese. Okay, so if you look at food prices, for example, and specifically dairy food prices, how do we compare to the West, to the OECD? So the OECD is the baseline. Here, are we with higher prices or lower? In 2005, prices in Israel were 6% higher. Now, the OECD doesn't show the most recent data, but the most recent that we could find was 2008. It should give you an idea of what happened. And prices by 2008 in Israel in dairy products were 44% higher than the West. Keep in mind that even if the prices are identical, our incomes are lower. So even if they're identical, it's still tougher in Israel. Okay? We're not controlling here for incomes, just showing you prices. In other areas of food, prices in Israel were actually lower in 2005 and higher by 2008. And if we look at agricultural produce, much lower prices in Israel in 2005, still lower in 2008, but the gap has fallen. The two big ticket items are cars and housing. Okay, again, things that were spoken about earlier. Let me give you a look at the numbers. If we look at cars, or personal transport equipment as it's officially called, in 2005, cars in Israel were 46% more expensive than in the West. And that's what happened since, 70% more expensive. When we talk about housing, in this case, the numbers come from Demographia, not ours. I'm just showing you their numbers. What they looked at, in this case, it does take into account incomes. How many years of work do you need to buy a house? In other words, how many years of median income do you need to buy the median house? In America, it's a house. In Israel, it's an apartment. We're not controlling for size here, but just to give you an idea. In the United States, you need almost 3 years of median income to buy the median house. Okay, and this goes up to almost 7 years in Australia. Above 5 years is considered severely unaffordable. Keep in mind that this is how many years of median income without eating anything. Okay, and we're not taking into account mortgages and things of that nature. This is what it looks like in Israel. And in fact, if you compare Israel to cities in these countries, then this is what it looks like. Israel in general is more expensive than this city in terms of the number of years you need to work to buy an apartment or a house. Now, another thing that raises prices in Israel, it raises costs and just makes us completely aggravated whether you're poor or rich, is the situation on our roads. I don't know how many of you are familiar with our rush hours or rush days or rush weeks. Only Shabbat, I think, is relatively free. Well, are we relatively congested compared to other countries? The number of vehicles per kilometer road in Israel relative to the OECD, we're very congested. We're over 2.5 times congested as the OECD average. The question is it because we have more vehicles per capita? And the answer is no. The number of vehicles per person in Israel is just half of the Western average. So we're actually at 2.5 times the congestion with only half the cars. Imagine as our incomes rise and become more comparable to the West, we're going to increase the number of cars. Where are we going to drive them? The problem is somebody forgot to build roads and trains, and we're now doing this. Eran showed you a little bit of the numbers in terms of investment from the Bank of Israel, but in general, even if you take private investment into account in Israel, investment in road and rail infrastructure in Israel relative to GDP, private and public, is roughly the Western average today. But the Western average is basically maintenance. We still have to build ours, okay? So somebody went to sleep. Again, I showed you the total expenditure. We're relatively responsible. Our problem is, how do we use it? What are we spending our money on? And here our allocation is not trivial. Another thing that drives up prices is bureaucracy. I believe Itamar Rabinovich spoke about this earlier. Well, do we have a bureaucracy in Israel? Yeah, we do. The number of days that you need to start a business, these are numbers from the World Bank. A comparison of all 33 OECD countries. It takes a long time to get something going in Israel. We have layer upon layer of bureaucracy. So if you have a lot of bureaucracy and you have a fleet of trucks standing on the road in congestion, then in addition to the fact that we have lack of competition and so on, you're going to get high prices. Now, these are some of the symptoms. This is the tip of the iceberg. Let me introduce you to the iceberg itself, okay? Because the iceberg, we can talk about two major problems, and one of them, again, I had to reshuffle a bit here, so I'm going to de-emphasize it in terms of showing you data, because you saw data about it, but it's definitely one of the problems. One of the problems is definitely the extent of income inequality in Israel and the share of people living under the poverty line. It's a huge problem, and it's much, much worse today than it was several decades ago, and it's much worse in Israel than it is in most Western countries. And again, I'm not going to repeat that data. You saw it quite a bit before. That's problem number one, big problem number one, the long-run trends as far as income inequality and poverty are concerned. The other problem is growth. Our incomes are increasing. You saw it before, but we're falling farther and farther behind in relative terms compared to the West. These two problems are related. Okay, again, in contrast to conventional wisdom, where we think either somebody's a bleeding heart liberal and all he cares about is helping the poor, or a capitalist only worried about economic growth. It's not. It doesn't work that way. The way it works is that if you give more tools and more ability to somebody to work in a modern economy, you help him or he helps himself. or she helps herself, but the economy also utilizes more of its cylinders, it grows faster. These two issues are related. Let me try to give you an idea of why what I showed you until now is just the tip of the iceberg. You take housing, for example. Conventional wisdom in Israel is that housing is expensive for a variety of reasons. One of them is that most of the land in Israel belongs to the government. Over 90% of the land in Israel belongs to the state of Israel. And we have a housing authority, which, depending on who you talk with, has varying degrees of corruption, although I don't know how it compared to, say, the city of Chicago. But there is a problem in that regard, but a more severe problem is that it acts as a monopoly, and it just, instead of worrying about the allocation, they are a primary cause of why housing prices are high. Is that the major reason? I don't think so. I think it has to do with something else that is very much related to the big problems. The slow growth, relatively slow long-run growth, and the high income inequality and poverty. And let me just give you an example to highlight it. If many of the people who were protesting in the cities, and primarily what cities? In Tel Aviv, okay? If you have a family, young family with kids, the two most important things they care about are education for their kids and work, okay? Now, there are places in Israel where the land is much cheaper, but who wants to live there? As much as our education system isn't very good in the cities, and I'm going to show you in a moment, it's much worse in the periphery. And if you don't connect the periphery, because we've neglected our transportation infrastructure, and Niran told you earlier today about physical infrastructure and the human capital infrastructure, well, here, the neglect of these two, especially in what we call the periphery, which in a normal country would be a suburb, that creates a situation where nobody really wants to live there. But had we given the best education in the world, or at least in Israel, in this area, and had we connected them with trains, roads, I'm not even going to get into that discussion, which is better. But most of the population in Israel should have lived within half an hour of one of the big cities. And if there would be good education there, then this young family living in the city would be able to double or massively increase their living space at a much lower cost. And then they would move there. Prices would rise there. Prices would fall in the city. You'd have less inequality. That's just one of the things that would happen. That's the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg is that these kids living there are going to get a much better education. And their parents and they themselves are going to be connected to where the jobs are in the cities. And they're going to be able to work and find work. And it's going to look a lot different in all these other main areas. So again, tip of the iceberg and iceberg. Let's now move to the iceberg. I'm going to put, again, aside the issue of income inequality because it's just been discussed. It's not that it's not important. It's extremely important. But I want to focus on the growth for a moment. To grow fast, what determines economic growth? It's productivity growth. What determines productivity growth? It's innovation. Innovation, that's us. I mean, you read the Startup Nation. We're really, really good in that department. Okay? So what's the problem? If we innovate, that should be translated into productivity, and that should be translated into growth. We should be growing faster than everybody else, not slower. So what's going on here? Where's the catch? So let's start with innovation. Are we really as good as we think we are in innovation? I'm going to show you just a few examples. One is academic, the other one is in the business sector. Okay, so academically, our ranking in the world by field, okay, this is a recent study done by Uri Kirsch from the Technion. He ranked Israel, or he ranked basically all the countries in the world in the different fields according to academic citations by articles. So you're netting out country size effects here. In the 1980s, we were number 1 in the world in economics, number 3 in chemistry, and so on. And if you go down to the bottom here, in all fields we were number 10. Now, we slipped a bit in the 90s. Still pretty good. And in the last decade, slipped a bit more, but still number 13 out of some 200-plus countries in the world. Not shabby, okay? Pretty good. And in fact, if we focus on economics for a moment, This is the rankings. Here are, according to academic citations by article, a study done by two Frenchmen that compares publication by number of pages per researcher in just the blue ribbon journals, just the top academic journals. This is a ranking of the European countries. So if we use the UK as the base here, it's 100, you can see that there's a big fall off. So in other words, the Spanish researcher, academic researcher, economics researcher, published only 21% of the UK researcher in the blue ribbon journals. That's what the 21 means here. Number one, you know who that is. Okay, you saw it earlier. But not just a little bit more, 7 times more than the UK. Okay? And this is an average for 30 years. So we're talking about much, much better. Okay? Now, put aside academia. How about in the business sector? One indicator of innovation is patents. Not that it's problem-free. There are problems with it. It's not the only indicator, but it's useful because it's easy to measure. So patents by Israelis versus patents by people from the G7 countries relative to country size, relative to GDP. 25 years ago, a huge difference. The G7 countries, these are the leading Western countries, had many more patents per country size or per GDP than we did. Since then, the number of patents relative to country size increased at the same pace, so they stayed relatively at the same place. In our case, the number of patents increased faster than GDP, and we were in the process of catching up until the mid-90s, and we actually overtook the G7 since then. So, yes, we're more innovative academically than many of the other countries in the world. In terms of patents, definitely we're up there. So now let's go into the next stage, productivity. Does this translate into productivity? Because we need productivity for growth. One measure, it's not the only measure, but one measure of productivity is GDP per hour worked. Okay, so you take the pie, GDP, divided by the number of hours worked. This is GDP per hour. 40 years ago, 42 years ago to be exact, productivity was higher in the G7 countries. That's why they're wealthier than us. Since then, productivity increased very steadily. That's why growth paths are very steady. You can see for 40 years, very steady. You can see the fall off in recent years. That's the big recession that the West is undergoing. We started off relatively backward, but caught up, so that by the mid-70s, we had almost reached G7 productivity levels. And then a funny thing happened. Even though we're at least as innovative as these countries, if not more so in some areas, our productivity increased, but as you can see, it increased at a slower pace. We're falling farther and farther behind the leading Western countries, and it's a very steady process for the past 35 years, or more than 35 now, almost 4 decades. Now, when you show this slide in Israel, most Israelis will shoot out what we've been saying here all day. It's pretty clear. It's the Arabs and the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. Why? Because they don't work. Well, newsflash. This is people who do work. We haven't even reached the people who don't work yet. I'll show you that slide in a moment. We already have a problem here with people who do work in Israel. What's happening in the slide here? The problem is that there are really 2 Israels in one. One Israel is the cutting-edge, high-tech Israel, some of the best universities and some of the leading high-tech companies, first world by any degree. But then there's all the rest. And this other Israel is very big, and its share in the total is growing. And this is the part of Israel that isn't receiving either the tools or the conditions to work in a modern economy. And it's like a big weight. It's just dragging everything down. You can see it literally here in the productivity. It's just pulling everything down. And again, this is the people who do work. Now let's talk about the employment in general. You could see earlier from Eyal's graphs that there's less of a problem of employment among women in Israel, even though there is a problem with Arab women and Haredi women. In general, even with them included, our employment rates are roughly Western average. The primary problem is with the men. And if you look at prime working age, 35 to 54-year-old men, 3 decades ago. Very high employment rates in Israel and in the G7, over 90%. In general, in the West, employment rates fell, and you can see the big drop-off in recent years as the West hit the recession. Now look what happened in Israel. Okay, you have a big drop-off in employment. You actually have 2 negative bubbles here. One is in the beginning of the 90s. That's when the Russians came from the former Soviet Union. Many people, roughly a fifth of the population of Israel in half a decade. So clearly you're going to have a very big drop-off in employment because a lot of people don't even know the language. Actually, the amazing part is this increase. The increase happened fairly quickly. I mean, not that there weren't problems in the absorption, there were, but very quick recovery here, but only partial. We didn't return to employment rates that characterize the West. We just returned to the trend, and and then you have the continuation decline. Then you have the other negative bubble here. This is the intifada. This is the recession. This was our big recession, and since then we've been climbing out of that hole. So our employment rates have been rising. But in general, you can see here we're falling farther and farther behind in terms of employment, in terms of productivity, and all of this translates into growth. So I showed you the post-1973 growth path. Let me show you now the entire growth path. This is what it looked like 2 years after independence, 1950, until the Yom Kippur War. It is a very steady path. Again, that's what growth paths look like. It's a very steep path because we were growing really quickly. This is the relevant portion of the American path. Okay, I showed you 140 years, but this is the relevant portion. Here you can see how fast Israel is catching up. In fact, had we continued along that path, we would have reached American living standards by the 80s or 90s. It wouldn't have been linear. It would have been a convergence process. It didn't happen. Now, this graph I've been showing for the past 12 years. Every year I just add another year because we're still on the same path. And the path is this one, the one I showed you earlier. We changed our national priorities in the 1970s. And we changed them in a way that we actually moved to a very steady but new growth path, a much slower growth path. And how problematic is this growth path? If we continue with the comparison to the United States, the average American in 1965 made 72% more than the average Israeli. This difference was cut to less than 40% by 1973. We were catching up. You can see it on the graph. And then, as we fall farther and farther behind, the income gaps rose. Now, again, since 2008, they've actually declined a bit because we've been growing faster than the U.S. as we come out of our hole and you go into yours. But in general, the long run path is one of falling farther and farther behind. That has major ramifications because while there are people who will live in Israel no matter what, many people have a price. And that price may differ from person to person, but as the gap rises between what you can get abroad and what you can get in Israel, there are going to be a lot more Israelis at NYU and in other places in America. Okay? And that's not going to end well in several years. Now, just to give you an idea what kind of a brain drain we're talking about, if you look at the number of foreign scholars in American universities relative to the total number of scholars back home, these are what the numbers look like at the beginning of the last decade. We're actually going to be calculating this again to see what it looks like now. But in general, these are numbers that concern many of these European countries because we're not the only ones experiencing a brain drain. So 2%, 3%, 4%, what does it mean? It means that, say, in the case of Italy, for every 100 Italian professors in Italy, you have 4 Italian professors in America. Okay? Then you have the Canadians, but there are a lot of Americans in Canada too. And then there's us. Okay? Now, again, this is not going to end well if we keep falling farther and farther behind. It's going to have major ramifications. In fact, if you look at just the top 40 American universities in some of the different fields, in physics, chemistry, philosophy, and so on, how many Israelis are there in just the top 40 American universities, in the top 40 physics departments, relative to all the physicists in Israel? Okay, it's 10%. By the way, how did I call someone an Israeli here? Not by the conventional method, just for those who are curious, because this is an academic audience. So if you're on sabbatical or on leave, you're not included here. In fact, if you were born in Israel but didn't grow up in Israel, didn't get at least a BA, didn't count you. You had to know us well enough to consider returning home because it's home. Only tenured or tenure track people are included here. And if you teach a course from time to time in Israel, I'm not including you either. Even if you're tenured, it doesn't include emeritus. So it's, in a way, it's even an underestimate a little bit, but it's bad enough. In chemistry, the number of Israelis in the top 40 chemistry departments, 12% of all the chemistry professors in Israel. In philosophy, 15%. Economics, 29%. And computer science, a full third. Now, truth be told, most of this has nothing to do with different income salaries. Much of it has to do with basically a starvation of academic positions in the universities for several decades. In some cases, and one of them is economics, it definitely has to do, money's playing a major role here. And in recent years, we've had to combine the graduate programs at Tel Aviv University and Hebrew University, which are the top two econ programs in Israel, simply because there's not enough professors there. So if you do an MA or PhD today in Israel, in Tel Aviv or Hebrew, some of the courses you do on Mount Scopus and some you do at Tel Aviv University because there simply aren't enough faculty. On the other hand, a study done here in the States, I'm just skipping the slide, I'll just tell you, but another study done in the States a few years ago, I looked here at the top 40. These guys looked at the top 10 departments, in this case top 10 econ departments, not at the stock of professors, but at the flow of professors. In other words, who are the tenure track professors and where are they coming from? Only in the top 10 American schools. And obviously the biggest group is American, but the superpower after America is Israel. Okay? 1 out of every 7 tenure track professors in the top 10 econ departments in America is Israeli. Okay, the UK has only a third of that, and France too. And these are countries with 70 million people or 60 million people. And we're the size of Dallas-Fort Worth. So, you know, this is a big issue, and it's not going to end better if we don't get our act together. But when we do talk about national priorities, when we look at staffing, for example, of universities, senior faculty per capita, then once upon a time, this very, very poor country that had to build roads and it had to build cities and towns and absorb people with only the clothes on their backs, also built universities. And so by the beginning of the 1970s, there were 7 major research universities on the ground in Israel. And when you look at what happened since, not one major university was built. Colleges, yes, but not a research university. And we're much wealthier. We have a lot more money. But this is what happened to the number of senior faculty per capita over the past 3.5 decades. And in fact, if you look at this period, the country's population doubled, but the number of senior faculty only rose by 12%. If you include all of the non-research colleges, it rose by 30%. So in per capita terms, we have a decline here of almost half. So we basically left a generation of people who completed their PhDs, were good enough to be in universities. We left them outside of the loop. In fact, if you look at this in absolute terms, not in relative terms, for a country that sees high-tech as its future, our MIT is the Technion. So how many positions were added to the Technion since 1973? 1. The 2 flagship universities, Hebrew and Tel Aviv, Hebrew University staff fell by 14%. In Tel Aviv, they're 1/5 less by 2006. The numbers have actually changed a bit recently, and this penny actually has fallen in recent years. There's now a major effort by the government to invest money in universities. I have a certain question regarding are they doing it wisely. But there is now a major effort to bring Israelis back, to spend a lot more, and to change a little bit this picture. But really, the bottom line is, even if the universities get a lot more money now, that's not going to fix this picture of a country falling farther and farther behind. It's not going to end well. And that's something that we need to take into account here. Now, returning to the main problem then, what is the primary threat in Israel? It's that a very large and increasing share of the population is unable, sometimes unwilling, but primarily doesn't have the tools or the conditions to work in a modern economy, a modern and competitive economy. And if we go back to the employment picture, okay, this is something that Eyal showed you earlier and I showed you a moment ago. If you look at the prime working age men in Israel for the past 40 years, but this time divide them up by education levels. Why? Because as the country grows, the demand for skilled and educated people rises, and the demand for unskilled, uneducated falls, or it falls in relative terms because the country is increasing. So if you look at the least educated of these prime working age men 40 years ago, those with no more than 4 years of education, they worked. Over 90% were employed. Now keep in mind that there are much fewer people today with only 4 years of education, so the supply has fallen drastically, but demand has just collapsed. So that employment for these people has fallen considerably. And if you continue with this comparison, you can see basically, this is the modern Israel, and this is the Israel that once was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, it didn't matter if you were educated or not. Everyone could find a job. In the modern country, and Israel is a modern country, the more or the less educated you are, the more difficulty you're going to have finding a job. And that's very clear here. And we have a problem in that regard which is not going to improve in the near future. It's improving in one way, it's a problem in another way. So let me show you a little bit of where it is improving, okay, in a comparison with the United States. If we look at prime working age individuals that didn't finish high school. Now, how you define didn't finish high school in a country where here you have to have a diploma, in Israel, just learning 12 years isn't enough. You have to have bagut or matriculation exam. The way I dealt with it is just looking at 11 years, okay? So 0 to 11 is 0 to 11. Clearly, if you didn't study beyond 11 years, you didn't finish high school, not in America, not in Israel. Now, let's look at the different groups within each of these countries and see how things have developed over time. So if we look at 45 to 54-year-olds, okay? Again, I'm going to divide up the prime working age into different groups here. In Israel, the Muslims, 69% of them, of the 45 to 54-year-olds, didn't have anything beyond 11 years of schooling. The Druze, very similar, even higher, 73%. The Christian Arabs looks a lot better than the Druze and the Muslims, but 43.9 is still very high, and this is what it looks like for the Jews. Okay? Now for the United States. Hispanics, 36.9. Blacks, less than the Jews in Israel of that group. Asians, much less, and whites, even less. So this is the older of the prime working age, 45 to 54. The middle group in prime working age is 35 to 44-year-olds, and you can see that there's not much of an improvement of Hispanics here in the States. Blacks, slight improvement. Asians, slight improvement. White, slight improvement. But look at the big improvements in Israel. For Jews, it fell by half. And this is just, one age cohort less. Christian Arabs, the Druze, and the Muslims. So there's big improvements in all four of the groups, although still not a pretty sight compared to the different groups in the States. Now you go to the youngest group of the prime working age, 25 to 34-year-olds. And here you can see that in America in general, you're kind of at a steady state. There is somewhat of an improvement in some of these groups, especially among the Asians. But in general, you're at the same place in terms of the share who don't finish high school or no more than 11 years. But in Israel, the improvement continues for all of these groups, and big improvements. So the direction is actually a good one. We're getting more and more educated. in all of these groups, which brings us then to the next question, which is what kind of an education are we giving these people? So here we can look at achievement in some of the core curriculum subjects, math, science, reading, and so on. And the most recent international exam that was given is the PISA in 2009. And if we compare Israel to really the relevant 25 OECD countries, even though some of them aren't even relevant, but say Israel is the base here, it's 100. How do the other countries compare? It's not the grade that our kids received in the class. Okay, this is just the base. In every one of these countries, the share is higher than in Israel. Keep in mind that this doesn't include the ultra-Orthodox. We can't blame them for everything. Their kids don't study the material. They don't take the exam. Actually, to be more accurate, the boys don't study the material, don't take the exam. Some of the girls study some of the material, and some of them do take the exam. But in general, they are not the problem that's causing us to be at the bottom of the Western world in achievement in core subjects. It does include Arabs, so many people can think, okay, it must be the Arabs. Let's net them out. If we look only at Israeli Jews who are not ultra-Orthodox, they are below all 25 OECD countries, okay? The Arabs, the education that we give our Arab kids in Israel, that's below third world, many third world countries, Tunisia, Jordan, Indonesia, and so on. Now some demographics. Again, this is the iceberg that I'm introducing you to here. This is the breakup of the kids in our schools in 2010, in primary schools, okay? These kids, the ones with achievement levels below the first world, where do they come from? They come from the religious schools, not the ultra-Orthodox, the state religious schools and the state non-religious schools. Keep in mind that the people who run Israel, okay, be they Likud, Kadima, Labor, most of them, not all of them, but most of them came from the state schools, the non-religious schools. This was once the big majority in Israel. Today, the number of kids who are not in religious schools is only 38%, so just above a third. In general, half of the kids, a little bit more, 52%, are receiving an education below the first world. These guys are receiving an education below the third world. And these guys don't even study the material, okay? So when we're talking about, we look at a modern country today and we look at the adults. The adults don't look like this. The adults, the statistics are different. You saw them earlier today. But this is the future. This is what the future is going to look like. Give you an idea how fast this future is changing. If you look at enrollment in the schools in the past decade, from 2000 to 2010, in primary schools, in the state schools, in the non-religious schools, almost no change at all, less than 0.5%. In the religious schools, 11%. In the Arab schools, an increase of 37%. And in the Haredi, in the ultra-Orthodox schools, in one decade, an increase of 57%. So this is our future. And these are the kids that we need to reach tomorrow morning. Otherwise, we're looking at some major, major issues here down the road. I actually had a few more slides to show you, but I can't leave you like that. So I've learned in the past year, I also have to show a bright side, because there is a bright side. There's a huge bright side. Some of that bright side, Dov showed you earlier. For example, living standards is not just money. Life expectancy, for example, as Dov showed you, our life expectancy has increased faster than in most of the Western countries. Today, Jews live longer than Arabs in Israel. Arabs live longer than Americans. And if you look at infant mortality, big improvements there. Investments. You saw patents. If you were to look at the Ministry of Industry website to look at what exactly we invented, these are some of the things that were invented in Israel. And they attract a lot of money. If you look at foreign direct investment in Israel, which is the serious stuff, it's not the speculative money, $600 million flowed into Israel in 1993, almost $6 billion in 2000, and over $10 billion in 2008. It's fallen since because of the recession in the Western world, so it's fallen everywhere. But you can see how much and how fast this increase. And if you're looking for startups, where do you look? This is the dangerous stuff, the venture capital. Investments relative to GDP, well, the country that's getting the highest share relative to country size, by far, is Israel. Okay, so everything, the world doesn't see yet, a dismal picture. We have a lot going for us, and so this is the final slide. This has been my final slide for the past 2 years. I just changed the year each time, but the data stays pretty much the same. The West is growing old. Okay, you need 2.1 kids per family to maintain the same population. Now, the average in the West, 1.7 kids. And in some of these countries on that side, they're growing really old really quickly. And so they're going to have major problems in the next few years of who's going to be paying Social Security, who's going to be taking care of the elderly, who's even going to be working. In our case, no problem. Kids, we got lots of kids. The question is, what are we going to do with these kids? Are we going to give them the best education in the Western world, something that we're capable of, because we have some of the best universities in the Western world? We have all the knowledge is in Israel. We don't have to import it. We're not, situated in South America or in the middle of Africa or in South Asia. We have some of the best places, some of the best universities, some of the smartest people there. It's a question of, are we going to be smart enough to pull out these stopgaps and let the knowledge that's already in Israel reach all of the different segments of the population? If not, we're sunk. But if we are, the sky's the limit, because we have more kids, we're younger, and if they get the best education, they have another thing going for them. Again, this has its good points, it's got its bad points. In these international exams, they measure not only achievement, they measure confidence. So on average, internationally, 40% of the 8th grade students had high self-confidence in learning math. This ranged from a low of 17% in Japan to a high of 59% in Israel. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but the Japanese kids actually know the material, okay? But if you ask them, they're not so sure. We don't even, we don't even know that we don't know the material. That's how confident we are. And so the bad side is, for the Israelis here, it's this culture of smoch. Yeh beseder, al tidag. Everything will be okay. Don't worry. Trust me. It's killing us, this culture. Okay, that's the bad side. The good side is we are supremely confident of our abilities. Okay, and you can slap us down, knock us down, and we don't even understand failure, which is again a problem. But we're not afraid to fail, and to innovate, you need to fail a lot to get the success through, and we do it. So imagine if we were able to combine it with the actual tools, where we could be. So again, we're at a point here where we need to make some major decisions. I personally believe that we haven't passed yet the point of democratic point of no return. Many of my colleagues think that we have. But that's where it is. So if you're interested in this stuff, you can download it from our website, or you can just send us a mail and we'll put you on our mailing list, or you can give me a card and we'll be happy to add you. Okay.
I'd like to thank Danny and all of the participants. It's established conclusively, if we were really as good as we think we are, we'd be fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings to an end our conference. Those who have been invited to the dinner and are staying on with us, we are now beginning the reception hour. Please make your way to the Kimmel building, which is 2 blocks to the east. Thank you very much.